Chapter 1. The entry he never made. Mark Stevens wasn't the kind of man people noticed twice, and that was perfectly fine with him. He liked the predictability of his mornings. Wake up at 6:45, shower, coffee brewed exactly 4 minutes too strong, toast, usually his own bread, and a 15-minute commute that rarely surprised him. His life wasn't thrilling, but it wasn't dull either. It was steady, comfortable, and in a world that felt increasingly loud, Mark valued quiet more than anything. That was why, on a Tuesday morning that had every intention of being as uneventful as the ones before it, he nearly dropped his phone into his coffee when it rang. He stared at the unfamiliar number for a moment, considering whether silence might be preferable. Then curiosity, and perhaps a flicker of responsibility, won. "Hello," Mark said. "Hi, is this Mark Stevens?" came an overly cheerful voice on the other end. "That depends," Mark replied, glancing at the clock. "Is this going to take a long time?" There was a brief pause, as if the caller hadn't expected resistance. No, not at all. I'm calling from Bake the Moment, and I'm thrilled to inform you that your application has been accepted for the upcoming season." Mark blinked. Once, twice. "I'm sorry," he said slowly. "My what has been accepted?" "Your application," the voice chirped. "Your bread portfolio was incredible, by the way. The garlic sourdough. Inspired." Mark leaned against the counter, trying to reconcile the words he was hearing with reality. "I think you might have the wrong person. Is this Mark Stevens? Age 32, residing—" "Yes, that's me," he interrupted, rubbing his forehead. "But I didn't sign up for any baking competition." Another pause, longer this time. Papers shuffled faintly on the other end. "Well, your name, photos, and submission were all verified. You've secured a spot. Filming begins this Saturday." "This Saturday?" Mark repeated. "Yes. Isn't that exciting?" Mark looked around his apartment, as though the walls might offer an explanation. The only thing that greeted him was a cooling loaf of rosemary rye on the counter. "Exciting isn't the word I'd use," he muttered. After ending the call, promising nothing, committing to less, Mark stood in silence for a full minute before picking up his phone again. There was only one person who could possibly be behind this. His mother answered on the second ring. "Mark, I was just thinking about you." "I doubt that," Mark said. "Nonsense. I always think about you in the mornings. Have you eaten?" "Mom." Her voice shifted slightly, the brightness sharpening into something cautiously defensive. "Yes. Did you sign me up for a televised baking competition?" There was a small but unmistakable intake of breath. "Now, before you get upset, you signed me up." "I submitted you," she corrected quickly. "There's a difference." Mark closed his eyes. "There really isn't." "I did it because you're talented," she insisted. "You never show anyone what you can do. You spend all that time baking alone. And for what? Your coworkers? That one neighbor you gave bread to last Christmas." "He gave the pan back," Mark said automatically. "That's not the point." "It kind of is." His mother huffed. "Mark, you're good at this. Your grandmother would have wanted people to see that." That landed differently. Mark exhaled slowly, his frustration loosening around the edges. "You could have asked me, and you would have said no." "Probably." "Exactly." She softened her tone. "Sweetheart, sometimes life needs a little push. This could be something wonderful." Mark glanced at the loaf on the counter again, its crust golden and imperfect in a way he found reassuring. Baking had always been his. Quiet, personal, controlled. A televised competition, on the other hand, sounded like chaos. "I don't know," he admitted. "You don't have to win," she said gently. "Just go. Have the experience. You always say you like trying new combinations, don't you? Think of this as one." Mark let out a small, reluctant laugh. "That's a stretch, Mom. Maybe. But you won't know unless you try." He hesitated, weighing the discomfort against something else he hadn't felt in a while. Curiosity. "Filming starts Saturday?" he asked. "Yes. That's 4 days. Plenty of time." "For what?" "To decide," she said. Mark shook his head, though she couldn't see it. "You've already decided for me." "No," she replied. "I just opened the door. You still have to walk through it." After they hung up, Mark leaned back against the counter again. The apartment felt different now. Not changed exactly, just aware, as though something had shifted slightly beneath the surface. He walked over to the cooling loaf and broke off a piece, spreading a bit of butter across the soft interior. The familiar motion steadied him. "A baking competition," he muttered. It sounded absurd. It sounded inconvenient. It sounded possible. Mark took a bite, considering. "You only live once," he said to no one in particular, the phrase feeling strangely foreign on his tongue. Then, after a moment, he added, "And apparently, sometimes your mother signs you up for things without asking." He exhaled, somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. "Well," he said, reaching for his phone again, "might as well see what I've gotten myself into." And just like that, Mark Stevens, perfectly content, entirely average, quietly extraordinary in ways he'd never bothered to test, took the first step toward a life he hadn't planned. He didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. Not all at once, Not dramatically, but in small, steady ways, like dough rising when no one's watching. Chapter 2, First Impressions. The studio lights were brighter than Mark had expected. That was his first thought as he stepped onto the polished floor of the Bake the Moment set, clutching a modest canvas bag that held the only things he convinced himself to bring: his grandmother's worn wooden spoon and a small notebook he'd never shown anyone. Well, he murmured under his breath, squinting slightly. This is subtle. First time? A voice beside him asked. Mark turned to see a tall man adjusting a bright orange apron, his expression entirely unfazed by the glare and bustle. Is it that obvious? Mark replied. You're blinking like you've just been introduced to electricity, the man said with a grin. I'm Theo. Mark. Theo offered a handshake, firm and easy. Relax, Mark. Everyone's nervous the first day. Some just hide it better. Mark glanced around, taking in the other contestants scattered across the set. Some practiced piping techniques into empty air. Others spoke animatedly into cameras as if they'd been born doing so. A few stood quietly, but even they carried themselves with an air of purpose he couldn't quite match. I'm not nervous, Mark said. Theo raised an eyebrow. Sure. I mean it, Mark insisted. Confused, maybe, slightly annoyed. Still processing how I got here. Theo laughed. That's a new one. Before Mark could respond, a sharp, authoritative voice cut across the chatter. Contestants, please gather at your stations. Mark followed the others to a long row of gleaming workspaces, each identical metal countertops, polished ovens, ingredients neatly arranged like some kind of culinary showroom. His name was printed on a small card at the front of his station. He stared at it for a moment. Well, he said quietly, setting down his bag. Guess it's official. You talk to yourself often? The voice came from his right. Mark turned and paused. The woman standing beside him moved with deliberate precision, tying her dark hair back into a clean, efficient knot. Her posture was confident, almost defiant, like someone who had long ago decided she didn't need permission to belong anywhere. Only when the alternative is saying something foolish to other people, Mark replied. She smiled, but it was quick, sharp, like a blade catching light. That's a dangerous strategy in a place like this. Good to know I'm already at a disadvantage. Elena, she said, extending her hand. Mark. Her grip was firm, her focus unwavering. So, Mark, what's your specialty? Bread, he said simply. Bread. She tilted her head slightly. That's specific. Is that a problem? No, she said, though her expression suggested she was still deciding. Just unusual. Most people aim broader. Mark shrugged. I like what I like. Elena studied him for a moment, as if weighing his answer. Confidence or stubbornness? Comfort, he said. There's a difference. That earned him a longer look and a more genuine smile. Interesting, she said. Before either of them could continue, the host stepped forward, their polished enthusiasm filling the room. Welcome, bakers, one announced. You've been selected from thousands of applicants. Mark winced slightly at that. To compete for the title of Bake the Moment champion. The applause that followed felt automatic, electric. Mark joined in, though his attention drifted. Thousands of applicants. He made a mental note to have a very long conversation with his mother later. Your first challenge begins now, the second host said, clapping once. Signature bread. 2 hours. Show us who you are. Mark blinked. That's it, he muttered. No instructions? Elena glanced at him. You need instructions to make bread? No, he said quickly. I just thought there'd be more structure. She smirked. Welcome to chaos, Mark. The clock started. Around them, motion erupted, ingredients grabbed, ovens preheated, mixers whirring to life. The room transformed into a controlled storm. Mark stood still for a moment, hands resting lightly on the counter. Okay, he said quietly to himself. Signature. He reached for flour, measuring by instinct rather than scale. The familiar rhythm grounded him, mixing, kneading, adjusting. It was quieter inside his own process, even as the world around him buzzed. You're not rushing, Elena observed, glancing over briefly as she worked her own dough with swift, practiced movements. I don't rush bread, Mark replied. It's a competition. It's still bread. She chuckled. You're either very wise or completely out of your depth. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Their conversation fell into a natural rhythm, intermittent but easy. What are you making? Mark asked after a while. Chocolate chili brioche, she said. He paused mid-knead. That's bold. I take that as a compliment. It is, he said. I just can't decide if it's brave or reckless. Elena glanced at him sidelong. And yours? Garlic rosemary sourdough, he said, with a cinnamon apple butter spread. Her hands stilled for a fraction of a second. Sweet and savory combination? It works, Mark said simply. Elena nodded slowly. That's either brilliant or confusing. Seems to be a theme today. As the minutes passed, Mark found himself settling into the work more fully. The cameras faded into the background. The noise dimmed. It was just him and the dough, familiar, responsive, honest. "You're smiling," Elena said suddenly. Mark looked up, surprised. "Am I?" "Yeah. First time since you got here." "Ha." He considered that. "Guess I forgot where I was." "Good sign," she said. "Or a bad one. Depends on how this turns out." "Optimistic. Realistic," she corrected. Time slipped by faster than he expected. When the final call came, "Hands off," Mark stepped back, wiping his hands on a towel. His loaves sat cooling, golden and fragrant. For a moment, he allowed himself a small, quiet satisfaction. "You did okay," Elena said, crossing her arms as she examined his bread. "Okay," Mark echoed. "For someone who doesn't rush," she added. "That's a compliment." "And yours?" he asked. She gestured toward her glossy, perfectly shaped brioche. "I'll let the judges decide." They stood in silence for a brief moment, watching as judges began their rounds. "Hey," Mark said after a while. Elena glanced at him. "Yes, if we both survive this round." "If?" she interrupted, amused. "Would you maybe want to compare notes?" he continued. "Not in a competitive way. Just curiosity." She studied him again, that same assessing gaze from earlier. "You're not what I expected," she said. "I'm getting that a lot today." A pause. Then she nodded once. "All right, Mark. Curiosity." He smiled slightly. "Curiosity." As the judges approached their station, Mark felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Not nerves. Not exactly excitement. Something else. For the first time since stepping into the bright, overwhelming set, he wasn't just reacting. He was participating. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as out of place as he'd thought. Chapter 3: Heat in the kitchen. Mark had expected the second day to feel easier. Didn't. If anything, the studio seemed louder than before, like the first day had simply been a warning, and now the real competition was beginning to hum beneath the surface. Cameras moved more confidently, contestants carried themselves with sharper intent, and somewhere in the distant corners of the set, Mark could swear he heard someone arguing with a mixer. He adjusted his apron, glancing down at his station. "Still here," he murmured. "Disappointed?" Elena asked, stepping into place beside him. Mark looked at her. "Not yet. Check back after the judges speak." She smirked, leaning against her counter. "You did well yesterday." "I survived," he corrected. "You're underselling it." "I'm staying realistic." Elena shook her head once, amused. "You're consistent, I'll give you that." Before Mark could respond, the hosts appeared again, their energy as bright and relentless as the lights overhead. "Good morning, bakers. After yesterday's impressive signature breads, we're raising the stakes." Mark folded his arms loosely, listening. "For today's technical challenge, you'll be baking, without a recipe, 3 identical loaves of braided enriched bread. Texture, uniformity, and flavor will all be judged. You have 90 minutes. Your time starts now." The room erupted into motion again. Mark didn't move. "Braided enriched," he repeated under his breath. "Butter heavy. Egg wash. Structured but soft." "You sound like you're talking yourself through it," Elena said, already gathering ingredients. "I am," he replied. "Good. Because there's no written backup this time." "I noticed," Mark said dryly. He reached for flour, movements slower than the others but deliberate. Around him, contestants rushed, measuring, mixing, muttering calculations. One pan clattered loudly onto the floor somewhere to his left. "Not your comfort zone?" Elena asked, glancing over as she started her dough. Mark shook his head. "It's not about comfort. It's about precision." "And you don't trust yourself?" He hesitated. "That obvious?" Elena shrugged. "You're thinking instead of doing. Thinking is usually helpful. In moderation," she said. "Overthinking will ruin your dough before the oven does." Mark gave a small, reluctant nod. "Fair point." He shifted his approach, letting instinct take over where calculation had stalled him. Butter softened beneath his fingers as he worked it into the mixture, eggs blending into a smooth, pliable dough. "Okay," he said quietly. "We can do this." "You talking to the dough again?" Elena asked. "I find it listens better than people." "Rude." "Accurate." She laughed, brief, genuine. "You're getting more comfortable here. That or I've accepted my fate." Their rhythm settled again, each working independently but aware of the other. Mark occasionally glanced at Elena's technique, quick, decisive, almost fearless. Her braiding was intricate and precise, the strands weaving neatly without hesitation. "You've done this before," he observed. "Family bakery," she said, not looking up. "Braiding bread is practically a birth requirement." "That explains the confidence." "That explains the pressure," she corrected. Mark paused. "You don't look pressured." "Appearances," she said simply. He considered that, then nodded once. Across the room, tension built. One contestant groaned loudly as their dough refused to rise properly. Another frantically reshaped a loaf that had come apart mid-braid. Mark focused on his own hands. "Even strands," he muttered. "Don't rush it." His first braid came out uneven. He stared at it, Well, he said, exhaling. That's unfortunate. Elena glanced over. Too tight on one side. I see that now. You can fix the next two. That's assuming I don't repeat the mistake. You will, she said matter-of-factly. Mark blinked. That's not encouraging. But you'll adjust, she continued. That's the point. He studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right, adjustment. His second braid improved, still imperfect, but more balanced. By the third, his movements felt steadier. Better, Elena said. High praise, Mark replied. Don't get used to it. Time ticked down faster than he liked. 9 minutes remaining, a voice called. Mark slid his loaves into the oven, setting the timer with a small breath of relief. Now we wait, he said. I hate waiting, Elena replied. You seem like the type. It's inefficient. It's unavoidable, Mark said. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the ovens like they might reveal secrets before the time was up. You know, Elena said, glancing at him, you don't act like someone who ended up here by accident. That's because I've had 24 hours to process it, Mark said. Shock wears off eventually. And now, he considered. Now I'm curious, he said. About what? How far I can go. Elena smiled slightly. That's a better answer. A beat passed. And you? Mark asked. Why are you here? She didn't answer immediately. To prove something, she said finally. To who? Elena shrugged, her expression shifting just enough to suggest layers beneath the surface. Still figuring that out. Before Mark could press further, the call came. Time's up. Hands off. They stepped back as judges approached, their expressions unreadable. Mark folded his arms, watching as the first loaf was examined. Texture pressed, braid inspected. Uneven, one judge noted. Mark nodded slightly. Fair. The second loaf. Better structure. Another nod. The third. Pause. Good recovery, the judge said. Mark exhaled quietly. Not perfect, Elena murmured beside him. No, Mark agreed. But not a disaster. That's progress. And yours? He asked. She lifted one shoulder. We'll see. The judges moved to her station next. Mark watched, curious despite himself. Her loaves were impeccable, smooth, evenly braided, shining with a perfect egg wash. Consistent, one judge said. Confident work. Elena's expression didn't change, but Mark caught the slight shift in her shoulders, the tension easing just a fraction. When the judges moved on, she let out a small breath. You already knew, Mark said. She glanced at him. Knew what? That you'd done well. She hesitated, then gave a small, almost reluctant nod. I had a feeling. Confidence, he said. Experience, she corrected. Right, Mark said. That. Elena studied him again, that familiar assessing look returning, but softer now, less guarded. You're improving quickly, she said. I learn from my mistakes. And from watching others? Mark smiled faintly. That too. Good, she said. A pause settled between them, not uncomfortable, just present. Next challenge will be harder, Elena added. I assumed as much. You ready for that? Mark looked around the bustling set, then back at his station, then at her. No, he said honestly. Elena's smile returned, wider this time, warmer. Good, she said. Neither am I. Mark laughed. A quiet, genuine sound that surprised even him. Well, he said, glancing at his hands, still dusted lightly with flour. Guess we'll figure it out. Together? She asked lightly. He met her gaze. For now, he said. Elena nodded once. For now. And as the next challenge loomed, unpredictable, demanding, and far beyond anything Mark had planned, he realized something important. The chaos wasn't going away, but neither was he. Chapter 4 needed trust. The announcement came without warning. Mark had just settled into the rhythm of wiping down his station, a quiet ritual that helped him think, when the host's voices cut through the low hum of conversation. Bakers, one called, clapping once to gather attention. Today's challenge is all about collaboration. Mark froze mid-wipe. That, he said under his breath, sounds dangerous. Elena, beside him, didn't look up from tying her apron. You don't like working with people? I like people, Mark replied. Individually, preferably at a distance. She smirked faintly. Well, today you'll have to like one of them up close. Fantastic. The second host stepped forward, smiling with unmistakable delight. You'll be working in pairs to create a cohesive bread display. 2 complimentary loaves and 1 spread, presented as a unified concept. Your partner will be assigned randomly. Mark felt something twist in his chest. Randomly? He echoed. Elena tilted her head, studying him. You worried? No, he said quickly. Then, after a beat, yes, that's reasonable. I don't know how anyone else works, Mark continued. I barely know how I work under this. He gestured vaguely to the lights, the cameras, the general atmosphere of controlled chaos. Elena crossed her arms. Then you adapt. Easier said than done. Everything is, she said. The host lifted a bowl filled with folded slips of paper. Come forward and pick your partners. One by one, contestants stepped up, drawing names and calling them out. Small murmurs spread across the room. Some pleased, others less so. Mark stepped forward when his turn came, reaching into the bowl. His fingers brushed paper, hesitating just long enough for him to question whether hesitation mattered at all. It doesn't, he muttered, pulling one free. He unfolded it slowly. For a second, he just stared. Then he let out a short breath that might have been relief. Elena, he said. From across the table, she blinked once, then laughed softly. Well, that's convenient. That's one way to put it. Could be worse, she added. Definitely, Mark agreed. I was picturing someone who thinks baking times are suggestions. They are suggestions, she said lightly. Mark looked at her. Please tell me you're joking. Her smile widened. Mostly. They moved to a shared station as instructed, the space slightly larger but still intimate enough to feel close. Too close, Mark decided. So, Elena said, resting her hands on the counter. We need a concept. Something cohesive. Mark nodded, slipping into the familiar comfort of planning. We could do contrast. Sweet and savory. Obvious, she said. Reliable, he countered. Predictable. Consistent, Mark replied. There's a difference. Elena tapped her fingers lightly against the surface. Or we could tell a story. Mark blinked. With bread. Yes, she said simply. He considered that. What kind of story? He asked. Elena's gaze sharpened, the idea already forming. Something that reflects both of us. Your precision. My risk-taking. That's one way to describe it. You have a better one? Calculated unpredictability, Mark offered. She laughed softly. I'll take it. They stood in thought for a moment. Then Mark said, what about something rooted in tradition? But slightly altered? Elena's eyes lit, just a fraction. Go on. Classic base breads, he continued, warming to the idea. But with unexpected elements. Not overwhelming. Just enough to shift expectations. A quiet surprise, she said. He nodded. Exactly. Elena leaned forward slightly. I like it. Good, Mark said, relieved. Because I wasn't sure I was making sense. You were, she said. I just needed to hear where you were going with it. Fair. They began to move, gathering ingredients with more coordination than Mark expected. It wasn't seamless, but it wasn't chaotic either. 2 breads, Elena said. One savory, one sweet, balanced, Mark agreed. And the spread ties them together. He hesitated for a moment, then said, I make an apple butter, cinnamon, a bit of brown sugar. It's subtle. Elena glanced at him. Your grandmother's? Mark paused, surprised. How did you? You mentioned her, she said simply. Yesterday, right? He nodded. Yeah, it's hers. Elena didn't say anything for a moment. Then, quietly, let's use it. Mark met her gaze. You're sure? It fits the concept, she said. Then, after a beat, and it matters to you. That landed deeper than he expected. Okay, he said. They worked. At first, their movements were cautious, 2 people adjusting to each other's tempo. Elena moved quickly, decisively. Mark measured and refined, smoothing the edges of her bold ideas. Too much garlic, Mark said at one point. It needs flavor, Elena countered. It needs balance. She exhaled, considering. Fine, we pull it back. And your side, he added. That spice blend. What is it? Citrus zest and a hint of chili. He blinked. In a sweet bread. Trust me. Mark hesitated. Then, slowly. All right? Her eyes flicked to his. All right? I'm adapting, he said. Elena smiled faintly. Look at you. As time passed, something shifted between them. The tension softened. Not disappearing, but reshaping into something more productive. Their conversations became easier, less guarded. You don't panic, Elena observed at one point. I do, Mark said. Just quietly. She snorted. That's not panic. That's mild concern. You should see me internally, he replied. I'd rather not. Wise choice. Later, as they shaped their dough side by side, their hands brushed briefly. Mark pulled back instinctively. Sorry, he said. Elena shook her head. You're allowed to exist in the same space as me, Mark. Good to know. A small pause followed. You always work alone? She asked. Mostly, he said. It's simpler. And better. Safer, he admitted. Elena studied him for a moment. You know collaboration isn't about giving up control, right? Mark glanced at her. Feels like it sometimes. It's not, she said. It's about trusting someone else not to ruin what you're building. He considered that, hands resting lightly on the dough. And you trust me? He asked. Elena didn't hesitate. I do. The answer caught him off guard. Why? He asked. She shrugged lightly. Because you care about what you're making. That matters more than perfection. Mark exhaled slowly. That's oddly reassuring. Don't let it go to your head. I'll do my best. The final minutes approached faster than either of them wanted. 90 seconds, the host called. Mark brushed egg wash across the loaves while Elena adjusted the presentation, her eye sharp and precise. Together, she said, moving the boards into place. Together, Mark echoed. Hands off, came the final call. They stepped back. The display stood before them. 2 loaves, distinct yet connected. The spread nestled between them like a quiet bridge. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elena said, softly, "That works." Mark nodded. "Yeah, it does." As the judges approached, Mark realized something he hadn't expected. He wasn't just proud of the bread. He was proud of how they'd made it. "Elena," he said as they waited. This wasn't as bad as I thought it would be." She glanced at him, her expression easing into a small, genuine smile. "Careful," she said. "You might start liking this." Mark huffed a quiet laugh. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." But even as he said it, he knew something had changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough, like dough that had been quietly rising, stronger, softer, more resilient than before. And for the first time, Mark didn't feel like he was doing it alone. Chapter 5, Rising Stakes. By the 5th day, the studio no longer felt like an intrusion. It wasn't comfortable, not exactly, but it had become familiar enough that Mark didn't hesitate before stepping into his station. The lights were still bright, the noise still constant, but he no longer flinched at either. Instead, he tied his apron with quiet certainty, his movements practiced, efficient. "Look at you," Elena said, arriving beside him. "Almost like you belong here." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Almost." She leaned against her counter, folding her arms. "Don't push it." "I wouldn't dream of it," he replied, though there was a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The past few days had settled something between them, a rhythm that felt less like cautious cooperation and more like something steady. Their conversations came easier now, woven through the work rather than interrupting it. Still, Mark noticed something different about Elena that morning. She was quieter. "You okay?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Elena didn't answer right away. She adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, eyes fixed on the empty workspace in front of her. "I'm fine," she said eventually. Mark tilted his head slightly. "You're saying that like it's optional." She huffed a small breath. "It is optional." "And the real answer?" Elena glanced at him, her gaze sharper than usual, then softer just as quickly. "It's getting harder." Mark nodded once. "Yeah." Mid-competition pressure wasn't subtle. It crept in through the ticking clocks, the narrowed field of contestants, the quiet absence of those who had already been sent home. "You don't seem rattled," she added. "I am," Mark said. "Just internally, as usual." She studied him for a moment. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Stay steady." Mark considered the question. "I don't think about winning," he said. "Or losing." "What do you think about?" "The next step," he replied simply. "What needs to be done right now?" Elena let that sit for a moment, then nodded slightly. "That's annoyingly practical." "I try." Before she could respond, the host stepped forward once more. "Bakers," one called. "You've made it to the midpoint of the competition, and today's challenge is designed to push you further than ever before." Mark exhaled quietly. "Of course it is. You will create a filled bread," the host continued, "with a filling that reflects something personal. It must tell us a story, not just through flavor, but through intention." Elena straightened slightly, her focus sharpening. "You'll have 2 hours," the second host added. "Your time starts now." The familiar rush surged back into the room. But this time, Mark didn't wait. He moved. "Personal," he murmured, gathering ingredients. "Story through flavor." "What's your story?" Elena asked, already measuring flour with precise speed. Mark paused, just briefly. "My grandmother," he said. Elena nodded as if she'd expected that. "Of course. I don't want to repeat the apple butter," he added. "Good," she said. "Don't repeat anything. Build on it." He glanced at her. "And you?" She hesitated. "Family bakery," she said finally. "Pressure. Expectations. Never quite enough." Mark frowned slightly. "That sounds heavy for bread." "It's honest," she replied. "That matters more," he agreed. They worked in tandem again, though this time the space between them felt different. Less about collaboration, more about parallel paths. Mark's hands moved steadily, combining ingredients almost instinctively now. He decided on a soft, enriched dough, something comforting, familiar. "What are you filling it with?" Elena asked. He hesitated. "Roasted garlic," he said slowly. "Herb cream, maybe a hint of cheese." Elena nodded. "Comfort." "Yeah." She glanced down at her own mixture. "Mine's citrus and spice again, but deeper. More conflict." Mark smirked faintly. "That tracks." "Be quiet," she said, though there was no bite in it. As time passed, the pressure began to build, not from chaos, but from expectation. Mark found himself second-guessing small decisions. Too much filling. Not enough seasoning. Texture slightly off. Stop, Elena said suddenly. He looked up. What? You're doing it again. Doing what? Thinking too far ahead, she said. You were fine 5 minutes ago. Mark exhaled, glancing down at his dough. I keep wondering if it's enough. Elena stepped closer, not invading his space, but near enough to make her presence clear. Enough for who? She asked. Mark didn't answer immediately. The judges, he said. She shook her head. That's not what you said before. That was before this started to matter, he replied quietly. Elena studied him, her expression softening. It mattered before, she said. You just didn't admit it. Mark let out a small, humorless laugh. Probably true. She crossed her arms, leaning lightly against the counter. You don't need to impress anyone here, Mark. I know that. Do you? He looked at her. No, he admitted. A brief silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just honest. Then Elena said, I've been trying to prove something my whole life. Mark tilted his head. What? That I'm good enough, she said. That I can take what I've been taught and make it mine. You've already done that, he said. She shrugged. Tell that to the voice in my head. Mark considered her words, then smiled faintly. Mine just asks if I remembered to set the oven temperature correctly. Elena laughed, quiet, but real. That sounds peaceful. It has its moments. They returned to their work, but something had shifted again. Less tension. More understanding. Mark stopped trying to anticipate every outcome. Instead, he focused on the texture of the dough, the balance of flavors, the small details that made the larger picture work. You look better, Elena said after a while. I stopped overthinking, he replied. Miraculous. Temporary, he corrected. Time slipped away. 5 minutes remaining. Mark assembled his final loaf carefully, slicing just enough to reveal the filling without overwhelming the structure. Looks good, Elena said. So does yours, he replied. Don't compliment me right before judging. Feels like bad luck. Noted. Hands off. They stepped back together. Mark wiped his hands slowly, his gaze lingering on his creation. You know, he said, I would have never made this at home. Elena glanced at him. Why not? He shrugged. Too complicated. Too exposed. And now, he met her eyes. Now I'm curious what it tastes like, he said. She smiled faintly. That's progress. As the judges approached, Mark felt the familiar tension. But it was different this time. Less about fear, more about anticipation. Whatever happened, he knew one thing. He wasn't the same person who had walked in a few days ago. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. And when his eyes flicked briefly toward Elena, and she met his gaze without hesitation, he realized something else. He wasn't doing this alone anymore. And for once, that didn't feel uncomfortable. Felt right. Chapter 6, The Sweet Spot. Mark didn't notice the shift all at once. It wasn't something dramatic. No sudden moment where everything clicked into place. Instead, it was subtle, like the way dough loosened beneath his hands when it had been worked just enough. A quiet understanding, settling in without announcing itself. By the sixth challenge, he no longer counted the cameras. He still saw them, of course, small red lights blinking like watchful eyes, but they didn't interrupt his thoughts anymore. They simply existed, part of the environment like the counters and ovens and the constant murmur of movement around him. You've stopped talking to yourself, Elena observed as she joined him at their stations. Mark glanced at her, tying his apron with a neat, practiced tug. I still do, he said. Just less out loud. Progress, she said. Debatable. She studied him, her gaze lingering a moment longer than usual. No, definitely progress. Before he could respond, the host stepped forward, their voices cutting cleanly across the room. Bakers, today's challenge will test not only your skill, but your creativity under restraint. Mark raised an eyebrow. That sounds contradictory. Elena smirked. That's because it is. You'll be creating a dessert bread, the host continued, that elevates flavor without overwhelming it. Balance, texture, and restraint are key. Show us finesse. Mark's attention sharpened. Dessert bread. Not unfamiliar territory. Your time starts now. The room surged into motion, but Mark moved with calm intention. This was closer to his comfort zone, where flavor mattered as much as technique, where subtlety counted. You thinking what I'm thinking? Elena asked, already gathering ingredients. That depends, Mark said. Are you thinking something complicated? Always. Then no. She laughed softly. Go on, then. Mark reached for flour, measuring by feel. Sweet but not overly so. Something that builds instead of hitting all at once. Elena nodded. Layered flavor. Exactly. And your layering looks like? He hesitated for a second, then said, cinnamon, apple, maybe a hint of brown butter. Elena's expression shifted, approving, but sharper. Safe. Mark glanced at her. Refined. Predictable, she countered. He smiled faintly. Reliable. She tilted her head, considering. If you execute it well, it could work. That's the plan. And your hint of brown butter better not be too subtle, she added. Otherwise, what's the point? I'll make sure it matters, Mark said. Elena nodded once. Good. And you? He asked. Her hands paused over her ingredients. Citrus again, she said. But softer this time, less sharp. Paired with honey and a light spice. Mark raised an eyebrow. You? Softening something? Don't sound so surprised. I'm intrigued, he corrected. She smiled, a slower, more thoughtful curve than her usual quick smirk. It's about balance, right? Even I can adjust. They worked in parallel, their movements no longer colliding but complementing. Mark noticed how naturally they moved around each other now. No awkward pauses, no accidental overlaps. Careful, Elena said at one point, glancing at his pan. What? Mark asked, looking down. Your heat's a little high, she said. The bottom's going to brown too fast. He adjusted it without hesitation. Thanks, she shrugged lightly. Don't mention it. A few minutes later, she muttered something under her breath as her dough resisted shaping. Too sticky, Mark asked. Elena glanced at him. Don't start. Add a little flour, he suggested. Not much. She rolled her eyes, but added a small amount anyway. The dough cooperated. I hate that you're right, she said. Mark smiled. I'll treasure this moment. Don't get used to it. I won't. Their conversation drifted as they worked, less focused on the challenge and more natural. You don't talk about your job much, Elena said suddenly. Mark shrugged. Not much to say. It's a job. You don't like it? I don't mind it, he replied. It's steady, predictable, no surprises. Elena glanced at him. You like that? I do, he said simply. She nodded slowly. Makes sense. And you? He asked. You always knew you'd be baking? Elena's hands slowed slightly, her focus narrowing as she worked. It wasn't much of a choice, she said. Family business. You grow up around it, you just step into it. Do you want it? Mark asked. She hesitated. I don't know, she admitted. I used to think I had to want it. Now, she exhaled softly. Now I want to make it my own. Mark nodded, understanding something unspoken in her words. That's not easy. No, she said. It's not. They fell into a comfortable silence after that, the kind that didn't demand filling. Mark focused on his dough, folding in the cinnamon and apple mixture with careful hands. The scent rose immediately, warm, familiar, grounding. Smells good, Elena said almost absently. It should, Mark replied. If it doesn't, I've made a serious mistake. She smirked faintly. Confident now. Comfortable, he corrected again. And there's that difference. As time slipped away, the tension returned, but it felt different this time. Not overwhelming. Not distracting. Just present. 10 minutes, the host called. Mark shaped his final loaf, brushing a light glaze across the top. He hesitated for a moment, then added a finishing touch. A subtle dusting that caught the light without overpowering the look. Nice, Elena said. Thanks, he replied. Yours. She gestured toward her bread, golden and elegant, the citrus glaze catching in soft, glossy streaks. Balanced, he said. Refined, she teased. Reliable, he returned. She laughed quietly. Hands off. They stepped back at the same moment. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Elena said, softly, I think this is the best I've done. Mark glanced at her, surprised by the admission. It shows, he said. She looked at him, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. You're not just saying that. No, he said. I'm not. Pause. And you? She asked. Mark looked at his loaf, then back at her. I made something I'd actually keep, he said. That's new, she said. It is. They stood side by side as the judges approached. Mark felt the familiar anticipation, but beneath it was something steadier. Confidence, maybe, or something close to it. As the judges moved between their stations, tasting, considering, Mark found his attention drifting. Not to their reactions, but to the space beside him. Elena stood with her arms loosely crossed, her posture relaxed in a way he hadn't seen before. You're calm, he said quietly. She glanced at him. So are you. Yeah, he admitted. A small smile tugged at her lips. Funny how that works. Mark nodded, the realization settling in. It wasn't just the bread. It wasn't just the competition. It was the balance. The way things had shifted, gradually, naturally, until what once felt uncertain now felt right. Not perfect, not finished, but steady. And as he stood there, waiting for the judges to speak, Mark understood something he hadn't expected when he first walked into this place. Some combinations worked not because they were planned, but because somewhere along the way they found their own rhythm. Chapter 7 Final proof. Mark had stopped counting the days. Somewhere between the early challenges and the quiet rhythm he'd found beside Elena, time had blurred into a sequence of moments rather than milestones. But when he stepped onto the set that morning, there was no mistaking it. There were fewer stations, fewer voices, and no margin left for hesitation. Finalists, one of the hosts said, the word carrying a weight that settled quickly into the room. You've made it farther than most. Today, you face your greatest challenge yet. Mark exhaled slowly, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the counter. This is it, he murmured. Eliminations tend to imply that, Elena replied quietly beside him. He glanced at her. She looked composed, more than usual but not untouchable. There was a tightness in her shoulders, a stillness that felt deliberate rather than natural. Nervous? He asked. Elena didn't look at him right away. Yes, she said, but I'd rather call it focus. That sounds better, Mark admitted. She finally turned to him, her gaze steady. You? He thought about it. Both, he said. I think I've earned the right to feel a little of both. A flicker of approval crossed her face. You have. The host continued. For your final challenge, you will create a complete bread experience. 3 elements that represent who you are as a baker. Technique, creativity, and identity must come through in every bite. Mark nodded slightly. 3 elements, he repeated under his breath. A whole story. Your time will be 3 hours, the second host added. And remember, you are no longer working in pairs. The words lingered. Mark felt them settle in. No longer working in pairs. He glanced at Elena, just briefly. She met his gaze, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Then she gave a small nod. Your time starts now. The room moved, but not with the frantic energy of earlier challenges. This was different, focused, intense, deliberate. Mark stood still for 1 second longer than necessary. Okay, he said softly. What do I want to say? He began gathering ingredients, his movements calm but purposeful. Comfort, tradition, growth. The words came to him without effort. His grandmother's influence was still there, but it wasn't all of it anymore. Not entirely. Something had shifted during the competition. Something had expanded. What are you making? Elena asked, her voice quieter now, more introspective than before. Mark glanced over at her, then back to his workspace. A progression, he said. Start simple. Build something more complex. Finish with something balanced. She considered that. Like a timeline. Yeah, he said. Something like that. Elena nodded. That fits you. And you? He asked. She hesitated. I'm not building a timeline, she said. I'm breaking one. Mark raised an eyebrow. Breaking? I'm taking everything I've been taught, she said, her voice steady but low, and reshaping it, not rejecting it, just making it mine. Mark smiled faintly. That sounds like you. She met his gaze, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. Good. They turned back to their work. For a while, there was no conversation, just the sound of measured movement, of dough being shaped, of ovens opening and closing. Mark focused on each component as its own moment. The first, simple bread. Clean, precise. No unnecessary complications. The second, layered. Herbs, subtle flavors. A step beyond familiarity. The third, something new. Something that carried both where he'd been and where he was going. He worked steadily, the process grounding him completely. You're steady again, Elena said after a while. I know what I'm doing, he replied. That makes a difference. It does. She paused, then added, You didn't always think that. No, Mark said. I didn't. And now, he glanced at her, then back at his work. Now I trust it, he said. Elena nodded slowly. I wish I trusted things that easily, she admitted. Mark looked at her, noticing the way her hands moved. Still precise, still confident, but carrying something heavier beneath. You do, he said. You just don't call it that. She let out a soft breath. Maybe. Time pressed forward. 2 hours remaining. Mark adjusted his second loaf, checking the texture carefully. Elena, he said almost without thinking. Yeah. You don't have to prove anything, he said. The words hung between them. She didn't respond at first. I know, she said eventually. But that doesn't mean I don't feel like I do. Mark nodded. Fair. Pause. Mark, she said. He looked up. If this had stayed a team challenge. She hesitated, choosing her words. We would have won. Mark blinked, surprised. That's a bold claim. It's an accurate one, she said. He smiled faintly. I agree. Their eyes held for a second longer than usual. Then they both turned back to their work. The final stretch came quickly. 30 minutes. Mark assembled his presentation with careful attention. Each element placed deliberately, nothing rushed. Across the station, Elena moved with equal precision, her focus absolute. 10 minutes. Mark stepped back for a moment, assessing his work. Not perfect, but honest. Elena, he said quietly. She glanced at him. No matter what happens, he said. This has been worth it. Her expression shifted. Something open. Something unguarded. Yeah, she said softly. It has. Hands off. They stepped back. This time, there was no shared display. No joint presentation. Just 2 separate creations. 2 separate paths. The judges approached slowly, their attention deliberate. Mark folded his arms, not tense, but aware. Beside him, Elena stood straight, her gaze fixed ahead. "You ready?" he asked under his breath. "No," she said. Then, after a beat, "But I am." He smiled slightly at that. As the judges moved from one to the other, tasting, questioning, considering, Mark felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not anxiety, not anticipation. Clarity. Whatever happened next, the outcome wouldn't erase what had already changed. He wasn't the man who'd walked into this competition unsure and untested. And Elena, he glanced at her. She wasn't just the confident competitor he'd first met. She was something more than that now, too. Something real. Something close. As the judges finished their evaluations, stepping back to confer, the silence stretched. Mark exhaled quietly. "Final proof," he said. Elena looked at him. "Yeah," she replied. "Final proof." But neither of them was talking about the bread anymore. Chapter 8, A Second Chance to Rise. The silence stretched longer than Mark expected. Not empty, just full of something unspoken, suspended in the space between effort and outcome. The judges stood a few steps away, murmuring quietly among themselves, their expressions carefully neutral. Around them, the studio felt smaller than it had before, as if the space itself had tightened around the moment. Mark exhaled slowly, letting his shoulders drop just a fraction. "Strangely calm," he said under his breath. Elena glanced at him. "That's new. I think I've run out of ways to be nervous," he replied. She considered that, then gave a small nod. "Fair." They stood side by side, but not together in the way they had been before. There were no shared trays now, no blending of styles. Just two separate journeys, placed next to each other at the finish. Still, the space between them didn't feel distant. "Bakers," one of the judges said at last, stepping forward. "This has been an exceptional final." Mark's attention sharpened, though his posture stayed relaxed. "You've each demonstrated skill, creativity, and growth," the judge continued. "But more importantly, you've shown identity. And that is what we were looking for." Elena's fingers curled lightly against her side. Not tense, but aware. Mark noticed. Without thinking, he said quietly, "Hey." She turned her head slightly toward him. "Whatever happens," he said, "you didn't just prove something. You built something." Her expression flickered. Surprise, then something softer, steadier. "Same goes for you," she said. The judge continued, their voice steady and deliberate. "Mark, your work showed a clear progression. There was a sense of grounding in your technique, but also a willingness to expand beyond your comfort zone. Your final piece, in particular, demonstrated balance and restraint in a way that felt very personal." Mark nodded once. "Thank you." "Elena," the judge said, turning, "your work was bold without being overwhelming. You took risks that could have easily gone too far, but instead, you shaped them into something cohesive. There's a strong voice in what you do." Elena straightened slightly. "Thank you." A brief pause followed. Mark felt it not as pressure but as inevitability. "And so," the judge said, "we have made our decision." The studio seemed to hold its breath. Mark didn't think about winning. Not anymore. He thought about the quiet mornings before this, the steady rhythm of his life, the smell of bread in his own kitchen, the absence of expectation. And then he thought about now. About the challenges, the risks, the conversations that had changed something he hadn't realized needed changing. Congratulations. The name that followed reached him, but not as sharply as he might have expected. Because in that exact moment, Mark realized something that made the outcome feel lighter. Whatever the result, he hadn't lost anything. He'd gained something instead. He turned toward Elena instinctively as the announcement finished. For half a second, neither of them spoke, processing, absorbing, adjusting to the finality of it. Then Elena let out a small breath, somewhere between a laugh and a release. "Well," she said softly, "that happened." Mark smiled faintly. It did. There was no awkwardness between them, no distance, just a shared understanding, quiet, steady, and real. "You were incredible out there," Elena added. "So were you," Mark replied. "That hasn't changed." She studied him for a moment, her gaze steady. "No," she said, "it hasn't." The hosts moved forward, wrapping up the moment with bright enthusiasm. But Mark barely registered their words. The cameras circled, the lights shifted, and the energy of the room began to lift into celebration. But Mark stayed where he was for a second longer. "You okay?" Elena asked. He nodded. "Yeah." Then, after a beat, "Better than okay." She smiled, this time without any edge, without the sharpness he'd first noticed when they met. It was warm, unguarded. "Good," she said. They stepped away from their stations together, not because they had to, but because it felt natural. "So," Elena said as they moved toward the edge of the set, "what now?" Mark glanced around, taking in the familiar space one more time. "Honestly," he said, "I have no idea." "That's not very reassuring." "It's honest," he replied. She considered that, then nodded. "Fair." A brief silence settled, but it wasn't empty. felt open. Are you going back to your job? She asked after a moment. Mark shrugged lightly. Probably. It's still there. But, she prompted. He hesitated. But I don't think I'll look at it the same way, he said. Elena tilted her head. Because of this? Because of what I can do, he replied. Her expression shifted, something like pride flickering briefly across it. About time you noticed, she said. Mark huffed a quiet laugh. I had some help. She didn't look away this time. Yeah, she said. You did. Another pause. Then, you know, Mark said, his tone casual but not careless. I usually bake alone. Elena crossed her arms lightly. Usually, he confirmed. But I've been thinking. That's new, she teased. He ignored that. Maybe it doesn't have to stay that way. She raised an eyebrow. You're suggesting what, exactly? I'm suggesting, he said, choosing his words carefully, that we didn't do too badly when we worked together. Elena studied him, really studied him, as if measuring not just what he said but how he meant it. We didn't, she admitted. And there's probably more we could try, he added. Different combinations, different approaches, different risks, she said. He nodded. Different balances. A small, thoughtful smile formed on her lips. You're inviting me to bake with you, she said. Yes, Mark replied. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced past him briefly, at the now distant stations, at the place where all of this had begun. Then she looked back at him. All right, she said. Mark blinked once. All right, she repeated. Curiosity, remember? He smiled wider than he intended. Curiosity, he echoed. They stepped out of the studio together, the noise of the set fading behind them. Outside, the air felt different, quieter, less structured, more like the world Mark had known before, but not quite the same. So, Elena said, glancing at him as they reached the edge of the lot. What's first? Mark thought for a moment. Then he said, I have a recipe I've been working on. She smirked. Of course you do. It's not finished, he added. Good, she said. Neither am I. Mark laughed quietly. Then I guess we're both still figuring it out. Yeah, Elena said. We are. They stood there for a moment, not rushing, not filling the silence, just present. Then, without any need for further agreement, they turned and walked in the same direction. Not because they had planned it, not because it was expected, but because it felt right. And somewhere in that quiet, unfolding start, not an ending, but a beginning, Mark realized something he hadn't known he was looking for. Bread was meant to be shared. And for the first time, he wasn't imagining it as a possibility, he was living it. Epilogue 5 years later, the bell above the door chimed softly, the sound warm and familiar, like a note that had settled into its proper place after years of practice. Mark glanced up from behind the counter without breaking the rhythm of what he was doing. His hands moved with quiet confidence, shaping dough into smooth, rounded portions with practiced ease. 5 years ago, he might have paused mid-motion, distracted by the interruption. Now he only smiled. Morning, he said. Morning, came the reply, irregular, judging by the easy tone. What's fresh today? Mark tilted his head slightly, considering. Everything's fresh. But the cinnamon apple loaves came out particularly well this morning. From the back room, a voice called out, That's because you finally stopped pretending the cinnamon should be subtle. Mark didn't even look up. It is subtle. It's not, Elena replied, stepping through the doorway with a tray balanced carefully in both hands. It just pretends to be before it hits you properly. She set the tray down on the front display case with a soft, deliberate motion. The bread gleamed faintly under the warm lights. Golden crust, delicate layering. A quiet kind of invitation. The customer leaned in slightly. I'll take one of those. Good choice, Elena said, already reaching for a paper wrap. Mark glanced at her briefly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You say that about everything. That's because everything here is a good choice, she replied without missing a beat. The exchange was effortless, natural. It had been for a long time now. The shop itself was modest, not large, not flashy, but it carried something neither of them had tried to manufacture. The scent of fresh bread lingered constantly in the air, layered with hints of butter, sugar, and spice. Shelves lined the walls, filled with loaves that reflected both of them. Some simple and grounded, others bold and unexpected. A balance it had taken time to find. Order up, Elena said, handing over the wrapped loaf. The bell chimed again as the customer left, the quiet of the shop settling back in behind them. Mark leaned slightly against the counter, brushing a bit of flour from his hands. Busy morning. Elena nodded, glancing out through the front window. It's been picking up more every month. That's because you keep convincing people to try things they don't understand. Excuse me, she said, turning to face him. I expand horizons. You confuse them slightly first, Mark corrected. Only a little, she said, holding up her fingers to indicate a very small amount. Mark chuckled softly. 5 years ago, he wouldn't have recognized this version of himself. Not because he felt fundamentally different, but because he felt expanded. Like something in him had been given room to grow without pressure or urgency. And Elena, he glanced at her again, not for the first time that morning. She had changed, too. Not in her confidence that had always been there, but in the way it settled now. Less like something she carried alone, more like something she shared. "Hey," Mark said after a moment. "Hmm?" she replied, already turning back toward the kitchen. He hesitated just briefly, not from uncertainty, from consideration. "We never really stopped," he said. Elena paused, glancing over her shoulder. "Stopped what?" "Building this," he said, gesturing lightly around the shop. "Together." She studied him for a second, her expression thoughtful. "No," she said. "We didn't." Mark nodded slowly. "And we never made it official." Elena blinked once. Then, slowly, she turned fully to face him. "Mark," she said, her tone carefully measured. "We own a business together." "I know," he said. "We spend more time here than anywhere else." "I'm aware. We've been doing this for 5 years." "Yes," he said, still calm. She crossed her arms lightly. "And you're saying that's not official?" He tilted his head slightly, meeting her gaze. "I'm saying there's one part we never defined." There was a shift in the air then, subtle but undeniable. Elena held his eyes for a long moment, something softer moving beneath her usual composure. "You mean?" She started, then stopped. Mark pushed himself off the counter, taking a single step closer, close enough to matter, not so close as to overwhelm. "I mean," he said, his voice steady, "this works. Not just the bakery. Not just the bread." A faint smile touched his lips. "You and me," he added. Elena absorbed that in silence. 5 years ago, she might have deflected. 5 years ago, she might have sharpened the moment into something lighter, safer. Not now. "Yeah," she said quietly. "It does." Mark nodded once. "So," he continued, "I was thinking, maybe we stop pretending that part isn't already real." Elena exhaled softly, a small, almost incredulous sound leaving her. "You're proposing this like you're suggesting a new recipe," she said. "I'm comfortable with recipes," he replied. "This isn't a recipe." He smiled faintly. "No, it's better than that." She looked at him then. Really looked, the same way she had in those early days, weighing not just his words but the quiet certainty behind them. "And you're sure?" she asked. Mark didn't hesitate. "I've never been more sure of anything that didn't involve bread," he said. Elena let out a soft laugh, shaking her head once. "That's a high bar." "It is." A pause stretched between them, but this time it wasn't uncertain. It was full. Then Elena stepped forward, closing the remaining distance between them. "All right," she said. Mark blinked once. "All right? All right?" she repeated, a small smile forming. "We make it official." Something in his chest settled. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the same quiet certainty he'd come to trust over the years. "Good," he said. "Good," she echoed. From the oven in the back, a timer beeped sharply. Elena glanced toward the sound, then back at him. "Don't burn the next batch," she said. "I won't," Mark replied. She lingered for just a second longer, then turned toward the kitchen. Mark watched her go, the warmth in the room feeling just a little fuller than before. He turned back to the counter, reaching for the next piece of dough. The rhythm returned, steady, familiar, but not unchanged. Because now, as the bell above the door chimed again and another customer stepped inside, Mark realized something with quiet clarity. Some things didn't need to be rushed. Some things didn't need to be forced. They just needed time to rise. And when they were ready, you knew.